Welcome to another Lunch Dev session. Thanks for tuning in. We got a really cool one today. Austin Krim is going to be showing us how to use Prisma, which is a super cool technology that is both an ORM and is not an ORM. So I don't know if we'll dive into that today, but it is both and it can be both. We're very excited for it to be both. And I think without further ado, Austin, I'm going to remove my spotlight and hand it off to you, and we're gonna learn some stuff about you. And actually, before we start, let me spotlight you. Tell us a little bit about yourself. What are you up to these days?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for the intro there, Michael. I appreciate it. So yeah, I'm a relatively new member of the React podcast Discord community conglomerate, whatever you want to call yourself. I've been listening to the React podcast for a little while. I just never gotten around to actually joining the Discord. So I'm happy to be here. It's been a really good time. Really enjoy the community. But yeah, my name's Austin Krim. I'm in Central Iowa. I've been a developer for about three and a half years now. It's relatively new. I actually studied mainframe development in COBOL in school and got my first job as a mainframe developer and did that for a year before I realized it maybe wasn't for me. So if you ever want to talk COBOL or JCL or green screens, go ahead and hit me up. So yeah, so as far as like web development, web technologies, I'm pretty much totally self-taught. After learning the COBOL stuff in school, while I was in my full-time role there, I tried to kind of taught myself web development in my spare time and was able to transfer roles internally. So I'm at the same company, but now I work on a full stack web application using React and Node.js and all those non-COBOL technologies. So
Awesome.
Yes. All right. So let's talk a little bit about Prisma. So Prisma is, per their website, they're an ORM. There's a little bit of colored history there. I won't get into too much detail of that right now, but yes, Prisma is something that helps your application talk to a database. So when I was learning web development, database access was never the part that I was really excited about. It was never the part that I really wanted to get into. So Prisma as a tool was kind of the first library, I guess you could call it, that's really gelled with my mental model and has made me not hate accessing databases all the time. So that's why I'm excited about it, and I kind of wanted to talk about it today. So from their docs, Prisma, they kind of like to divide their product into three parts. So I'll highlight those three parts now, and then I'll try and keep that context as we move throughout the demo and make sure that I outline which of the three parts we're talking about at any given time. So they have Prismaclient is the main thing, and this is the thing that you're probably thinking about. This is the thing that you're going to import into your code. You're going to use that to interact with your database, where you're going to do your finds and your creates and your reads and everything. It's called Prismaclient. It's a strongly typed library, so you get your autocomplete and your TypeScript errors if you're writing TypeScript, as well as if you're using vanilla JavaScript, they'll provide that autocomplete for you as well. This library is actually dynamically generated based off of your database schema, and that's something that will make a lot more sense when I show it to you as we get further in. The second part is Prisma Migrate, which is mainly a command line interface to help with database migrations, which is always a scary concept, but it helps keep your schema file in sync with your actual database schema wherever your database is hosted. Kind of helps you walk through that. And then the third thing is Prisma Studio, which is really a user interface to view and interact with your data. It's a layer that you might be familiar with some other database clients that you connect to your database and look at the rows and tables. It's similar to that, with the main difference being that you actually view your data through the lens of your Prisma models. So the data that you look at isn't actually mapping one-to-one with the underlying database tables and rows. It exactly matches up with how your schema is modeled. And that will make more sense as well when I get into it. So let's write some code. So up here I have Rotten Potatoes, which is a movie reviewing app. I'm not a UI designer, and so I have some minimal CSS here. So this app lets you type in a title and select a rating for any movie that you've seen, and it'll keep track of a list for it here. And you can also delete. So it's a basic CRUD app. If I can go into it right now, and I can say that Spider-Man 3 was a 10 out of 10 because of the dancing scene. So I'll add that review. And this app actually already works, so you'll wonder why am I starting here? But right now we're just keeping all this state in memory. I'm using Next.js, so there will be some Next.js concepts that we'll run to as we go throughout. But you don't have to be super familiar with Next.js, so make sure and highlight where we're running into those. So I'll do my best to separate. I chose Next.js because it was the simplest way to get up and running, to have a client side and a server side component in the same app without switching context too much. So here we have our app. It works right now, but we're not persisting any data. So that's probably not super realistic to how most applications are. Almost all applications need to persist data at some level. And there's not, I'll try and skip over the irrelevant parts here, but you have an app and you're at a spot where you want to persist data. So that's where the database comes in. And full disclosure, I already have a database hosted right now. So I'm not going to talk about that part. I didn't want to spend too much time on it. But there are several good options out there if you want to host a database for free. I'm using Heroku to host Postgres. There's also fly.io. There's Railway. Supabase, I think, has a Postgres offering. So there's a myriad of options out there if you want to host a relational database free of charge, at least for little demos and hobby projects like that.
Could I hop in with a quick question, Austin?
Yeah, jump in.
So I know this is a point of I guess clarification that I want to make, is that it seems like Prisma used to include a database, and it sounds like it doesn't any longer. Could you speak to that part of it?
Yeah. So the early version of Prisma, there was a hosted aspect of it where you would have to host your Prisma. Back when it was Prisma 1.0, there was a hosted aspect of it. That's no longer true. You bring your own database in this scenario, and we'll talk a little bit about more what that looks like when you get into that connection piece and how it works with existing databases versus if you're doing something greenfield. But that is true. Prisma 2.0 shifts that a little bit.
Gotcha. So if you already have a database, you can use Prisma to map to like rows, columns, tables inside of the database you already have.
Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit more as I pull up the schema file and we start talking about how that works. But yeah, I appreciate that clarification. And yeah, that reminds me, anytime anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute, jump in, or throw something in the Discord. I'm very happy to be interrupted by anything. So yeah, I appreciate that clarification. So we have an app, we want to persist data. I already have a database hosted in Heroku. I also have, let's see. Yeah, I have a .env file with the connection string that I'm hoping I don't open accidentally. So that part you'll also have to set up as well if you're doing that from scratch. That's another part that I have done already. So we want to bring Prisma into our project to help us with this database stuff. The first step, like all great projects, it starts with installing dependencies. So we're going to bring in Prisma. I'm using Yarn, so I'm going to say Yarn add Prisma. Let me know if it's too small. I can bump up the size there. So I'm going to say Yarn add Prisma. And I hope it doesn't take too long so I don't have any jokes or anything to fill time. So it's done. So we've installed Prisma. We have our dependencies. And Prisma, we're going to reference using npx to run some command line commands. So we're going to use npx, which is going to look at that Prisma executable in our node modules. We're going to say npx Prisma init, and that's going to help us get started. So when we first initialize a project, it's going to give us some tips in the command line output on how to get started. Like I said, I've done a little bit of this beforehand, but I'll make sure and talk about all the things that we need to do. So it first tells you need to have your connection string in a .env file. Like I said, I've already done that. I'm not going to show that. And second, it tells us that we need to set a provider in some schema. So npx Prisma init created this Prisma folder, and it created a schema.prisma file inside it. So let's go ahead and open that up so we can get a look at that. So schema.prisma, it has some stuff in here already, and I'll talk through that really quick. and then we can get into modeling our data. So it starts off with this data source block. And there are two things in here. One is the provider, which it defaults to Postgres, which is good because that's what I'm using. Prisma, I think, currently supports Postgres, MySQL, SQL Server, SQLite, and they also have Mongo in early access, which is really exciting to have in the future, have one tool to interface with both relational and non-relational databases. I think is something that's going to be really big for Prisma in the future. So we're using Postgres for our URL. We're using a built-in env function that's going to automatically look for our .env file. Like I mentioned, I already have it in the root of our project with our with a field called database URL that specifies my connection string. So that's the data source block, just talking a little bit about what database we're using and how to get talking to it. This next block is the generator client block. And you'll almost never have to change this. But this specifies what client or what language we're actually going to use when we use Prismaclient, when we import into our code. So currently they support JavaScript, and they also have a Golang client in early access. So I think they included this block in here to offer that future flexibility. If they start offering their client libraries in different languages, this is the place you would specify it. So those are the two fields we started off with. And now let's try and model our data and see if we can get our database going with a new table. Before I do that, I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to say npx Prisma Studio. So Prisma Studio is that tool oh boy. Well, maybe we won't do that right now. Okay, so it doesn't want me to open it because we don't have any models yet.
Okay.
That makes sense. So we'll do that later after we open a model or write a model. So let's write our first model. So with our super simple app, we have two fields, right? We have a title field, and then we give it a rating, which is a number. And so how you write models in the Prisma schema file. And actually, one more thing I'll mention before I get started. So I have the Prisma VS Code extension installed. I highly, highly recommend that you install this before you do any writing of Prisma schema files. It's very, very helpful. So I do have that installed, so we'll get a little bit of IntelliSense and formatting from that. So again, so I want to write a model. So I'm going to say model, and our database model is going to be called review. In relational databases, each table has to have a primary key or something that uniquely identifies the row. So I'm going to have an ID field. It's going to be an integer. And you could do something like a UUID or something like that here. I'm going to keep it simple and just have an integer that starts at 0 in auto increments. To mark this field as the ID or the primary key, Prisma offers an @ID decorator, if you will, which says this is the field I want as my primary key, and this is also how you will reference this model if you have any other tables that need to reference this via foreign key. So I want this to be my ID. Like I mentioned, I want it to just start at 0 in auto increment. So I'm going to give it a default value, and Prisma exposes an auto increment function that will just do this for me automatically. It will set up the SQL behind the scenes that anytime I insert, it'll just grab the next number and increment it by 1. Next, like I mentioned, we have our two fields. We have a title, which is a string. And we don't have to give this any other extra information. This string data type is a Prisma specific data type. So they do offer ways to drop down to the SQL or the database level if you want to specify any data types that Prisma doesn't expose directly. But if things like, if you wanted to specify a certain length for a variable character field, I think is a really common one. You can drop down to the database level and do that as well. I'm going to keep it at the Prisma level for now. And we'll have one more field, which is the rating. And like I mentioned, I have this Prisma extension installed. So if I just do my control space from here, it'll pull up a list of all the available data types. I'm going to keep this as an integer as well. So this is our model. And I know when Prisma 2 came out, one of the things they wanted to focus on was having a schema language that was easy to read. I personally find this very readable, but that also might be because I have prior context and I've been in Prisma a little bit longer, but I don't think it's anything too arcane. I think it's relatively easy to read, especially once you've done it a few times. And especially for a small app like this one. So we have our model. We have our schema definition. Now we need to sync this with our database. So my database is out in Heroku. It doesn't know anything about our models yet. And this is where the Prisma Migrate command line tool comes into play. So when we make changes to our schema, we need to get those up to our database somehow. So if this was a production app with the existing data and I wanted to change my schema, I would need to do a database migration. If any of you have experience with database migrations, they can be scary and hard at times. I'm not going to get into too much of that now, but know that the Prisma Migrate tool does help you with that. I'm going to say npx Prisma, and the Migrate tool offers kind of two separate commands. And I found this kind of confusing at first. So they have a Prisma Migrate command, which you would use in your, like I mentioned, your production or your real world scenarios. When you run Prisma Migrate, it will generate migration files for you. So you'd run Migrate, you'd give it a name, and it would generate those .SQL files for you behind the scenes that you could then use to keep track of your migration history. There's a simpler way of doing it if you're just doing prototypes or demos. I can run npx Prisma db push, which is going to push my local schema up to the remote schema and get my database in sync. This doesn't generate any history or any migration files. So again, this is more meant for prototyping, demos, things like that. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. So a couple things are happening. So we get some console output that says connecting to my database, blah, blah, blah. And we have a line here that says your database is now in sync with your schema. So it's gone out, it's connected to my Postgres in Heroku, and it's behind the scenes generated that this SQL definition languages and defined a new table for me based off of the model. The second thing that it's doing is running the generate command. So Prisma has a Prisma Generate command, and this is where we get into that dynamic Prisma client. So now that we have a model, it's going to generate a specific custom Prisma client based on our model, and it sticks it in our node modules. So we'll get into this a little bit later, but now we have an @Prisma/client node module that is generated specifically for our database model. And that's why we get the strong typing in the autocomplete as well. Travis, I see your question about having multiple fields in the ID, and you can do that. I think the syntax is something like this, where you do @ID, and then you'll pass in an array of different fields that you'd like to use as that composite key. And one more thing I'll throw out, the Prisma Docs I think are really good. They include not just API reference, but they have a lot of good examples about integrations, general database concepts, things like that. So we have our model, we've synced it with our database. And if I try and run npx Prisma Studio now, it should let me in, I hope. And it does.
Hooray!
Which is good, yeah. So we see here, we have 3 columns. We have that ID, we have the title, which is a string. We have a rating, which is, we specified as integer. There's no data in here yet, but you can see in this top left, we're looking at the review model. So let's connect this with our application. So we'll flip back over to our index page. Again, there are going to be some Next.js concepts in here. I'll call those out as we get into them. But again, Prisma works in any server-side environment. So we just have an index page, and I'd like to fetch the reviews from the database before we render our page. So Next.js offers a get server-side props concept where it will run some server-side code for you and then expose those as props to your page before it renders. So this is Next.js specific code here. And I'm going to get some server-side props. It's going to be an async function. And this is where we can write some database access code and then return that data to our page so that it's available on render. So like I mentioned, we have the Prismaclient node module dynamically generated in our node modules folder. So we can go ahead and import that now. So we're going to import from @Prisma. And this exposes to us a Prismaclient. And then from there, we'll instantiate a new Prismaclient. And this is where we can pass any options. If we want any client-wide options, you can pass an options object here. It's probably a good idea to pull this out and do a separate file as a single Prismaclient instance and import it in the rest of your application code if you want those options to be available everywhere. I'm going to do it in line here just for simplicity. So this Prisma variable is now an instance of the Prismaclient. And this is where we're going to expose the rest of our functions to access, create, update data. So I want to get some reviews. So I'm going to say const reviews is equal to Prisma. And I want to hit dot. We're going to get a list of commands. So on the Prismaclient, it exposes some lower level, I'll say, commands where you can manually connect, manually disconnect. The connection in this scenario will happen automatically. I won't have to call those. You can execute raw SQL queries if you want to. You can do some transaction things. You can do some eventing. And this is all more advanced SQL stuff that we won't get into. But you will notice it exposes this review property. And this is where that dynamic node modules concept comes into play. So it generated a review property on this Prismaclient because we have the review model in our schema. So if I want to get reviews, I say prisma.review. And I want to grab them all. So I'm going to say, oops. We're getting covered up by this big VS Code's trying to help me. But prisma.review dot, and it exposes all these different functions that we can do. So in my scenario, I just want to find them all. So I'm going to say find many. You'll notice in this long type definition, it actually returns a promise. So we're going to wait that promise so we get access to those reviews. Now, Next.js asks that you return a props object. So we're going to return our reviews in that props object, which will give us access in our Next.js page. So up here, reviews will be a prop, and we'll automatically get access to those. So we've connected to our database and queried all of our reviews in 2 lines of code. And now we're going to bring those back up to the Next.js page so that we can get access to those. So again, this get server-side props concept is a Next.js thing. So on request, it's going to run this code on the server and then expose that data on the client. I don't want to get too far into the Next.js weeds there, but if any of you have questions, you can feel free to reach out.
Got a quick couple questions for you, Austin, if you got a second.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So first, with the was it Prisma deploy? Is that the command that you ran?
Prisma migrate is
okay.
the command suite, but there are a few different commands in there.
Gotcha. Okay. So that, if I understand correctly, that is actually running these migrations and then pushing that into your node modules directory. So when you import when you create your Prisma client, it's actually getting the benefit of all of your types.
Yeah, so there's a couple different things happening there. So when you run, so the command I ran specifically was db push, which is that prototyping command, which just looks at your schema and gets it up to the database. There's actually a separate command, Prisma Generate, which does the generation of the client that sticks it into your node modules. Okay, cool. So when you run a db push, it knows that you're changing your schema, so it automatically runs the generate command for you in the background. But this command will need to be ran. This command has to be ran after you change your schema in order to get the correct typing information in your code.
Cool. And then we had another question, which I was also curious about. So Jasper's asking, if you're defining a schema like this already in GraphQL, are you basically doing this twice now with Prisma as well? Or is there some kind of like shortcut? And you don't have to go into that if it's like off topic, but I think addressing it would be helpful.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a really common one, especially for people using GraphQL. So the short answer is the schema will have to be written twice. There are tools that will help you do it. So there are some community tools that will automatically generate Prisma schemas based off of GraphQL schemas or vice versa. A lot of times people find that they'll actually want their GraphQL schemas to vary slightly from how their database schema looks. There's a little bit of nuance there. It's not a super tight integration, but there are tools that will help with that generation. That's basically the short answer. Okay, so where are we at? So we've accessed our database. We said we want the reviews. We're returning them from our Next.js get server side function here, which is going to pass them in as props to our page. So we don't need this review state anymore. So we're not going to manage it like that, which I think is maybe going to give us a few other errors here. Where I was doing where I was setting specific state. Yeah, here we go. I can do that anymore. Our handle submit, we're not going to do that anymore. We'll get into that. Oops, a little bit later. So when I start my app here and I refresh the page, it should be going out to the database looking for reviews and bringing them back for us. And there's nothing in there, which makes sense because our database is empty. So let's look at Prisma Studio again. So again, this is the view into our database, and I'm gonna add a record really fast so that we can see it show up on our UI. So again, I'll add. I notice some of you didn't like my Spider-Man 3 take. So here's a different Spider-Man movie. And I'll give it a 10 out of 10. I really like that movie as well. So I'm going to save this, and this is going to create a new row in our Postgres database out on Heroku. So now when I come over here and I refresh, it's going to run my server-side code again. It's going to run that fetch, and we have our data. So we have a Next.js app talking to a database and bringing those props back. And again, I said a couple lines of code here. It automatically does that database connection for us. And then we just find all of our reviews and we return them. So we're successfully connected to a database for reads. There are a lot of Spider-Verse lovers out there for sure. Yeah. But we have lost some functionality here because we used to have the ability to delete, to create, and we're going to go ahead and add that now. Before I do so, I'm going to pause and just highlight something really fast about the TypeScript support here. So when I call prisma.review.findMany, it automatically knows that I'm going to return an array of reviews. And Prisma automatically generated the TypeScript types for us based off of our schema. So if I look at my reviews, it's going to know that it's an array. So it's going to show me all of the array methods here. If I wanted to get access to a single review and check what kind of autocomplete I'll have there, it has all my fields already for me, properly typed. And in a small app like that, it might not seem like much, but as your app grows in complexity, having the automatic TypeScript checking there is absolutely huge. Let's see where we're at. Okay, so we have a red underline here because we have an implicit any. And kind of going along with what I just mentioned, Prisma automatically generates the types for you when you're accessing data, but it also exposes those types to you through the Prismaclient package. So I can actually import our review type from Prismaclient. So I'm going to say this reviews is actually an array of reviews. So I can import review. And you'll notice that I updated my import from Prismaclient, and this is an array. So then I'll have proper type checking as well. Okay. So let's create some data. So in Next.js, again, this is a Next.js concept, but I'm going to create an API route, which is basically just going to give me a serverless function built right in. So I'm going to make a new folder API, and I'm going to call it reviews. This is going to give me a serverless function where I can do more database access, and this is going to handle the creating and the deleting of reviews. So we're going to have a handler, and it's going to be of type next API handler. It's going to be equal to an async function, gets a request, gives a response. And we're going to do some Prisma stuff in here. So I mentioned this earlier. I'm going to go ahead and do it now. A lot of times you'll see this creating of the Prismaclient instance in its own folder, and then any other files that need to get access to it imported. So you're not creating Prismaclients everywhere that you need to do database access. So I'm just going to make a lib folder and move this code over here. And hopefully Typescript will help me out. And we'll export it. Now, whenever we need to get access to this Prisma client, we can import it from one spot. And we'll import Prisma from our local Prisma folder. There's that. Okay. So now we're in our serverless function. Let's handle the creates first. So let's see, what do we want to do first here? So we're going to send over some fields in a request body. So I'm going to look in the request body, and we're going to get a title and a rating from the request. Now that we have that, let's save this review to our database. So I'm going to look in Prisma. Oops. Make sure I import it from the right spot here. I'm going to, again, look on my review attribute, and I want to create. So you'll notice one cool thing. It gives me an example of what creating a review looks like, and this is obviously customized to the model, my specific model, because the node modules is dynamically generated. So it's telling me that to create a new one, I need to pass an object that has a data property. So I'm going to open up this options object. And it wants me to have a data property. And if I look to autocomplete to help me again, it tells me exactly what I need to fill in. So I'll pass the title and I'll pass the rating here. Now, the create method returns the newly created row. So I'll save that in a new review variable. And I also need to remember to await, because Prisma functions are asynchronous. After I create that review, I'll check my response to make sure it worked. Oops, that's not what I want. So this will actually throw an error. I'm not going to worry about error handling right now. As I seem to say a lot, even throughout my day job. I'll get back to error handling. Export handler, default export. So after I've created this new review, I'm just going to return that review as JSON. So we're taking a request. We're going to pull out the title and rating from the body. We're going to send that title and rating through Prisma over to our database to create a new row. And then we'll return that new row as the response from the API. So on the client side, this is where we'll need to do a client-side fetch. So I have a handle submit function. And we're already tracking our title and our rating in React state. So here we'll do a fetch. We'll get the response back from our fetch, and our API route will just be available on /API/reviews. That's what we named our file. Again, that's the Next.js construct. We'll make sure that we're posting. our body will be a JSON stringified object, just passing along the title and the rating as well. We'll make sure that we set our content type so that Next.js is able to parse the body. Does that make sense to you? See, just making sure I didn't mess anything up here.
Looks good to me.
Okay, let's give it a shot. And then we can do some stuff with the response later. But so we already have Into the Spider-Verse in our database, so it's already showing up. Let's stick with the Spider-Man theme. How about the Andrew Garfield classic, The Amazing Spider-Man 2? In my book, this gets a 0, so I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to leave it right there. And I'm going to pop the network tab just to make sure we're making the correct request and we get back a good response. So we got a 200 and it returned to us our newly created movie. If we look in our studio and refresh, we have our new row. So we have the create part in place. You'll see that our UI didn't refresh automatically, which makes sense because I didn't tell it to. But we can do a cheap. I'm going to just do a cheap trick here to make Next.js refresh the page for me. Okay. So we have the reading, we have the creating, everything's type safe. Again, the type safety is such a huge part of why I love Prisma. It's not demonstrated super well with a project of this simplicity. But as you get more relations and more fields, it really makes all the difference. So we have creating, we have reading. Let's see where I want to go from here. I'll do a little bit of error handling just for the folks at home. The good old-fashioned alert.
I have to say your scoring rubric for these Spider-Man movies is really stirring something up.
And sparking discussion in the chat. No, that's great. Okay, yeah, so we can read, we can create. Prisma's doing everything we want it to do so far. So let's talk about, let's do delete really fast too. I haven't done delete yet. So I'll hop back over to my serverless function. And what I'll actually do is I'll check the request method. And if it's post, we'll run this code. And if it's delete, we'll do something else. Trip all that. When I finish this up, we'll have total feature parity with my in-memory version that we started with. And I hope you'll agree it wasn't too bad. So if it's a delete, we'll just have them pass the ID in the body. There's a lot of ways you could do this, but I'll just do it this. We'll just do it a simple way. And then again, we can get the deleted review as the result of this Prisma call. So I'll say Prisma review, and that pop-up is enormous. I can get rid of that. It offers a couple different ways to delete. So we can do it bulk delete, or we'll just do a single delete. I'll opt for that. And we want to delete, and this is showing a little bit more of the API of how you interact with data through Prisma. When you call delete, you'll pass a where property, and this is very reminiscent of how it would look in raw SQL as well. Is equal to ID, or in shorthand, where the ID. And then we can just respond with that deleted review. So we have our API route handling creates and deletes. I'll find my delete button, and I'll just wire up a quick on click. Just make sure I get this right. And what we're going to do again, we're just going to make a fetch. We'll fetch to that same endpoint, and we'll pass a delete instead. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this from our create. We're going to fetch against reviews. We're going to pass the delete method, and then we're going to pass the ID in here. So what we'll do is we'll specify the ID as a property, and then we'll grab the ID from this from our existing review where we're mapping here. So we'll have access to this through review.id. And again, we're getting that IntelliSense. And then if this works, I felt guilty saying that I was going to skip error handling, so I feel responsible to add at least something in now.
It's your stream, man. You do whatever you want. You do you. We can handle the errors are ours.
Yeah.
Those are ours to do.
Yes, yeah. So if it worked, we're just going to again do that cheap trick to make Next.js refresh the data for us. Otherwise, we can again alert something went wrong. Close up some of this complexity. So let's click the red X and see what happens. Cool, delete's working.
Sick.
So now we have full feature parity with where we were when we started out just using React State. And I hope you'll agree with me, that wasn't too bad. I think partially because Next.js is really nice, but also partially because Prisma makes interacting with the database very, very simple. Yeah, so let me just check my notes, make sure I'm hitting everything. If anyone has any questions, great time to throw it out.
Yeah, let's throw out any questions if you got them. You can just unmute, ask.
Yep.
Do your thing. I have to say, it's really interesting to see kind of, I mean, I know it's interesting because like when I think of ORM, coming from like a Rails background, right? Like I'm thinking about like Rails objects mapped over, like database calls, I guess. And I don't know, it's so ingrained in Rails that like I just don't even think about, like it's just part of Rails, right? This is really interesting because you're getting one of the huge values I'm seeing here, just as you type, is all of the types, right? So you don't even have to go to documentation. You're like, whatever. Like if you can remember the basic CRUD operations, like delete and create, you type that, and like now you're just you got all your information right there to do exactly what you want to do. Like that is a really incredible feature of Prisma.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'll mention, like in a demo this simple, it doesn't really do that justice for how much that speeds up your development workflow. Like you said, I'm not writing and then crap, what's that field called? Swap over, check documentation. And it gets really, really powerful, especially when you get into more complex relations, because when you use the Prisma API and say, you want to find let's say our reviews were decoupled from the movie. So let's say we had a movies table and we had a reviews table where they were related through some kind of ID. And we wanted to select a movie as well as all the reviews for it. Prisma would help you out with your typing, as you'd say movie.find, and you could say, give me the movie, but also select the review title and the review rating and all these different things. And all of that is completely fully typed, and the autocomplete helps you out immensely. So again, in a simple demo, it doesn't really convey that as well as I'd like. But in more real world apps, it makes a world of difference.
Yeah, I love that. Love it.
Okay, so I have one more idea. I see. Are we shooting for an hour? Is that the duration we're looking for here, or what's the?
Yeah. We usually like to try and keep it to an hour, just because usually people have to, get back to meetings or work or what after that. But yeah. So I'd love to see one more if you got it.
Good. So, our network tab's going crazy here. So let's try and add a field here. So let's say we can review a given movie with a simple number, but a lot of times we'll have maybe we'll have comments, or maybe we'll have a description of this is why I'm giving it this rating. So in the Spider-Man 3 case, I'm giving it a 10 out of 10 because I love seeing Tobey Maguire dance. So let's change our model here and see what that workflow looks like. So I want to add a field where we'll get some space for I'll call these my musings. So I'm going to have musings about these movie reviews. And again, I want that to just be a string. So the workflow that I showed before, you change the model. In my case, I'm going to use Prisma DB push, which is going to go out to my Postgres database, create that data definition language behind the scenes, and then alter the table. Let's see what happens if I try this. Whoa, something happened. So I'm adding a new required column to the review table, and it doesn't have a default value. I already have data in the table. I can't add a new row without specifying what should happen to the existing rows for the musings column. So it tells me if we really want to apply this change, we can reset the data. Do you want to do that? I'm going to say no, I don't want to do that. Let's talk about a different option. So this is where the Prisma Migrate tool really tries to help you as you work through these different, trying to add features, things like that. It gives pretty helpful error messages in my experience. Something like this where it tells you we can't do this. This is why. This is what we can do. So in my scenario, we're trying to add a new required column. We're not giving it a default value, which tells it how to deal with the existing data. So I could either make this column optional, which looks like this in Prisma, a question mark, which is reminiscent of optional chaining in JavaScript. I can say, this column is optional. It doesn't have to be on every row. Or again, I could give it a default value and just say, give it a default of an empty string. Let's try that method. I'll save. I'll rerun my DB push. And now it looks like it's working and it's regenerating my client for me immediately. Travis, you can do enums instead of strings. So I could say an enum rating and say, give my 1 through 5 stars here, and then you could reference it in your schemas just like that. Again, for any of these other specifics, I think the Prisma Docs are really good. So now we have our database in sync with our schema. It's regenerated our Prismaclient for us. If we check Prisma Studio, we should see a new column. And it's not showing, probably because, well, why isn't that showing? I expected that to show up for me. I don't know if it's not showing just because we don't have a value in there, though I expect it to show every column in my database for me. Unsaved changes. Oh, there it is. Okay. I think I was in some weird intermediate state. So now it shows we have a new musings column. For this particular movie, it's empty. I could say best Spider-Man movie since Spider-Man 3. And I can edit the data directly in here and I can save it. And I can swap back and refresh the page. And it's not going to work because I'm not running my app. And we should see my new comments show up. And I haven't added that in the markup either. So we have to add it in the markup. And I'm just going to copy and paste something real quick here. Don't want to spend too much time on this. So if we have musings, we're going to include them in underneath the title. So now we have successfully added a new field to our schema. Prisma helped us through the process without losing any data. Again, if this was more like a production environment, we would want to use the Prisma Migrate command as opposed to the DB push command, and that would generate those schema files for us behind the scenes. Or we could have that that audit trail and that reproducibility that migration files give you. So we could add a text area here that that would allow us to send through more data. That would allow us to send through our musings if we wanted to. All that's not super related to Prisma. It would just be adding another input and then passing it along here. So again, this was a super simple start to getting Prisma up and running in your project. I'll go ahead and make sure I have this all in a public GitHub repo, and I can send along where I started and where I ended. So you can use this as a reference to a simple start to Prisma. I've alluded to it a few times, but I think Prisma really shines as you get into more database relations. Your schema gets more complicated. That's where the type checking can just save you an immense amount of time, in my experience. So yeah, again, I would encourage you to check out the docs. They have really good, not only API references, but different guides and different database concepts that they explain out there as well. But again, I think that's it for me. I think I can wrap it up here. I'd love to talk more about Prisma. If anyone has any questions afterwards, feel free to reach out to me or throw anything in the chat and we can keep the conversation going. But I think that's it for me.
Awesome. Awesome. I was trying to say awesome and Austin, that was awesome at the same time. So awesome it is.
Yes. Yeah.
Hey, this is amazing. Thank you so much for this introduction. I did want to, before we totally wrap up, I just wanted to kind of bring in one question, which is, you mentioned at the beginning the different databases. And so it seems like as long as you have a database behind the scenes that can be connected to, via a public URL, and is supported, is a supported database type by the Prisma ORM, which I can post in a link about what those types are, that you should be good to go. You don't really need any more than those two things.
Yep. Yeah. As far as I know, and one command that I didn't mention is Prisma also has a DB. We've been using DB push. They also have a DB pull, which if you're starting from scratch with an existing database, DB pull will introspect the schema and recreate the schema file for you to the best of its ability. Now, there are some limitations on different features that Prisma doesn't quite support yet. But if you're looking to get a start on something existing, you can go ahead and use that and it'll get you most of the way there.
Interesting. So that would be useful if I have, like, let's say I already have an app and we're doing, I don't know, we're connecting to the database by some other means and it doesn't have all of this really cool, like, type generation and whatnot. We can do a pull connect, or it would probably, I assume that we would have to do that Prisma init first, get that file, connect it via that string, and then run pull, and it's going to create a schema for us.
Yep, absolutely.
Killer. That's awesome. That's wild. And so this would also, if I'm not mistaken, give us an opportunity to trial it before in kind of like running it, right?
Yeah.
Like just kind of pull this, kind of see how it all works, see if it's something that we're interested in.
Yeah, for sure. You definitely, that's a great way to get started. Like I said, your mileage may vary on how far DB pull will be able to take you, just because of Prisma doesn't support the wide breadth of database features that are out there right now. But I think that'll get you off to a good start.
Cool. And you had also mentioned that there were some escape hatches as well. Are those fairly well documented if you do need to kind of go lower into the database feature?
Yeah, for sure. So there's two main ones that I'm thinking of right now. So the first is if I can grab the Prismaclient and they have these, they call them the raw functions. So I can say query raw and then literally pass in SQL as a string, and this will run it for you. And then again, if you know the type of data, you can also pass in a generic, maybe one of the types that Prisma generated for you, and then those results will be typed as well.
Interesting.
The other one is when it comes to schemas, they have, when you're defining data types, I can't remember the exact syntax, but there's a syntax where you can basically specify a database specific data type. So in Postgres, you can specify, I want this exact time stamp format, or I want a string, but I only want it to be 200 characters long, or things like that. You can do that in the schema as well. And again, the documentation is very good on that front.
Nice. Well, hey, that's awesome. I feel like we got a really good glimpse into how to get this set up and kind of how to migrate or explore or test things out. Any parting thoughts, or are you good?
Yeah, one thing I'll just say, this was my first stream, or like first presentation, and I say that not to excuse any of my inevitable mistakes or anything that I made, but in the fact that I am super open to feedback. If anyone's wanted to reach out and say this went well, this could be improved, anything like that, I'm super open to it. So feel free to reach out.
Yeah, well, I thought you did awesome. This was amazing. I would have never guessed that this was, your first time doing this. You were very well organized. Very, very nicely done. And then also, you just started a newsletter. You want to, pitch that for anyone who's watching this later or watching right now?
Sure, for sure. Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, so I started a new project this past week called Perusing the Platform. I'm going to be writing a little blog post and demo for native web APIs. So my first one was on the web notifications API, and I have a little demo of how that works, as well as an explainer. I'll be getting into things like the geolocation API, the URL API, form data, URL search params, all the things that are built into the platform that I didn't know about and that I'm going to be learning a ton about. And I'm excited to share that with everyone. So perusingtheplatform.com if you want to see that first article, and there's a link there to sign up to the newsletter as well.
Cool. This is awesome. Anyone else before we take off have any questions they want to ask?
Where'd you get your taste in movies?
It was inevitable.
I shouldn't have gone I should have gone something safer. You're right. I should have picked something else for the first demo here.
No, honestly, I was watching this and I was like, you know what? This is what my presentations have been missing. Taste controversy. That's really what I needed to invest more into next time I get it.
It's a way to get the chat going, at least.
Man, I need to start doing this for like the semantic streams. Just say something controversial. That way people like have to let me know how wrong I am. And that way Twitch rewards me with all of the achievements that are like, people are participating in your chat. Who's the real winner?
Feel free to steal that tactic, Ben.
I have actually legitimately heard that like some people, like some content creators will deliberately slip in just a little bit of like wrongness to like facilitate just enough conversation in that regard. I've definitely heard of people who do this.
It definitely works.
Think about now we're in the weeds for sure, right? But like this is, I think, something that is probably one of the beauties of like Bob Ross's format, right? Is that you're watching it and it's like it's going great, and then you have those ruined moments, right? Like this is why like he was like the original of this. Like just do something that gets everybody angry and then fix it.
Yes.
Great.
I'm just going to put a big line right through the middle of this.
And he does it with a smile.
Cool. Hey, awesome. Oh my gosh, I did it again. Awesome.
That's his official name now.
Yes.
Yep. Register that domain.com. Get it?
Yes.
Well, it's hot. Hey, thanks so much for doing this. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this and want to get other videos like this from our lunch sessions, or as we teach stuff and learn stuff together, subscribe, enable notifications. Am I doing this right? Is this how this all goes? I think that's how it goes, except I'm supposed to be cooler about it, but I'm not. Anyway, but most importantly, join the Discord community. That's where we're hanging out most of the time and getting to know each other and learning together throughout the week. So that's events.lunch.dev/Discord, and come hang out with us. We'd love to meet you. So that's it. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time. Peace. We did it.
Ooh.
Cool.